So this today is all about Raptor ID, but I do want to share that it's more introductory, and we're calling it an overview, and with a special focus on a two-part series. And the reason for that is anyone who's talked Raptor ID knows that we could talk for hours about one species for that matter, and how we're identifying these birds, whether they're perched, hunting, or flying. And so one of the things that I've learned over the years doing this, as I've looked across my audiences, I've figured out when the eyes start to glass over, when I need to make changes. And what I found is if I go too fast and try to cover too much material, that tends to happen. It goes over people's heads, and it just doesn't seem to be successful. So we're splitting this into two parts. We're going to feature part 2 in March of next year. Just like we're doing here in August ahead of the fall season, we want to target part 2 ahead of the spring season. And how we've broken this into two parts, it's not about early, mid, or late season raptors. It's more about, we're going to start with the more regularly occurring raptors that you're going to see at most of the hawk watches across the nation. And then part 2 will feature more of the less occurring, not necessarily rare, but the birds that you don't tend to see so often, the rough-legged hawks, the goshawks, and things of that nature. So today we're going to go through 8 species commonly seen across the U.S. And then part 2 will finish that up with another 8 or 9 species next year. The thing that I always like to feature when I start these ID talks is I want to feature a few video clips to get people excited. And the first one is really featuring a rough-legged hawk that's just soaring effortlessly. And the reason I show this is, you know, I work in a large building full of people, and I tend to be that bird nerd. And oftentimes people will ask, you know, what's with the birds? How did you get into this? Why are you into birds so much? And, you know, honestly, this video speaks to me, because who doesn't want to fly? And if I had a superhero trait, you couldn't even ask me what that trait would be. I would be saying flight immediately. I'm so jealous of these birds, even though nature is very rough and they have definitely arduous lives. Seeing this just makes me so jealous, and seeing this rough-legged just fly so effortlessly makes me want to be up there right with them. So I hope you enjoyed that. The next video, I'm featuring more of a hunting technique of an American kestrel. I love this video clip. And you're going to get to see real close how these birds hunt, especially when they're using their hover hunting style. Today's talk is less about hunting and perched birds, and more about Raptor ID in flight, especially in migration. So we will focus on that, but I can't help but show you this awesome clip. So this is a female kestrel hover hunting, and take special note of that head. Look how locked on and frozen her head is as her body, legs, and wings are flailing about. Look how locked on that head is. And for you photographers out there, that's nature's image stabilization right there. So just a wonderful clip to see up close how they're hunting in the wild every day. Now this last clip that I'm going to feature is from one of my home hawk watches, the Mackinac Straits. And you'll see actually the bridge that makes Michigan pretty well known, the Mackinac Bridge there. And you'll see 2 bald eagles fighting over a fish. And near the end of the clip, you're going to see a pretty astounding behavior come into play. So here you can see an adult with that white head and tail chasing an immature bird. And halfway through, the roles changed, and the immature started going after the adult. The adult has a fish in its talons, and this bird's trying to get at that fish. Bam. And again, it's going after the fish. This is not a courting display. Sometimes eagles do display a tail and grab and tumble in the air in courting, but that was definitely a fight for fish. So I hope you enjoyed those clips. I do. It never gets old seeing some of these raptors doing what they do best. And hopefully that got you a little interested and excited for what's to come today. So I like to start out by just giving you some things to keep in mind. And I always like to start out telling people to really make sure that you set realistic expectations for yourself in terms of how much you think you're going to be able to know and capture and be prepared for when you do visit your local site. The other thing to keep in mind too, as we see here, migration timing does vary by location. And so you can, just as we learned last month from Dr. Wargo, We had an introduction about hawkcount.org and what a resource that is. And that is one of our premier resources that HMANA offers. You can go to hawkcount.org anytime and easily plan a trip to find your local hawk watch, when to go, and that sort of thing. What I love to do using Hawk Count, especially when I'm traveling, is I'll go through month summaries, day summaries, and dial in when I need to go to that particular site for the individual species that I'm after. So if I'm going to Allegheny on a trip and I'm really interested in golden eagles, I can use hawkcount.org to really dial in that first or second week in November on when to visit to up my chances of seeing golden eagles, if that's a species that I'm really working on trying to get better at identifying. So it's a great resource that you can keep in your back pocket. I love to tell people that bird identification is really the place where science and art can collide. And I say this because if you've ever spent time with a bander, whether it's raptors or passerines or what have you, it's really a scientific method in terms of how they're measuring, weighing, and documenting what they're finding in these birds that they're catching. Where the art comes in, however, is anyone who's ever seen a raptor in the sky knows that it's a little less scientific in that it takes a different type of method, and it's more of a gut feel as these birds are coming in when you're looking for different types of things other than field marks. And so the big advice that I like to give people is really, don't think of one field mark or way of identifying a raptor in flight as being the diagnostic way to identify a raptor. My example that I love to share is the white rump patch of a northern harrier. So often you can see raptors with undertail coverts, especially in high winds, that will get folded up and over the tail, making it appear that they have a white rump. And many, many times I'll find myself at a hawk watch hearing someone yell out a harrier only to find that it was a Cooper's hawk or a juvenile red tail showing those undertail coverts or that whitish looking rump. And so point being, don't use that one trait as your diagnostic way of identifying a northern harrier. Look at those long, slender wings. Look at the modified dihedral that it shows in a glide, how it's behaving, how it's buoyant in the air. All of these other things put together can really dial you into a much more artistic way with a little touch of science to get these birds identified properly. The last thing that I always like to share is I don't really consider myself an expert. A lot of people roll their eyes when they hear that and say, oh, sure you are. Well, remember, everything in life is relative. So I can bet money that I could go through the participant list on this chat or this meeting right now and find several people that are more expert than I am at hawk watching. And that's a good thing to keep in mind because you want to always have this mindset of continuous learning. Think of yourself as a student. Think of yourself as someone who's always going out to learn. And that kind of attitude and mindset will go a long way in terms of learning ID. And before you know it, you'll start to gain confidence and get better and better yet. So always think like that student. The other thing that I always like to tell people, especially if you're e-birding, whether it's raptors or not, it is okay to mark birds as unidentified. You might know that it's an accipiter, but you had a fleeting view or you couldn't get on the bird in time to see if it was a Sharpie or a Coop, but you know without a doubt it wasn't a goshawk. You might put that it was an unidentified accipiter or an unidentified raptor. That's 100% okay. Also be willing to fail. The failures are where we're going to learn the most and come out stronger in the end. So be willing to fail, think like a student, and totally be okay if you can't identify everything. Everyone who considers themselves an expert will have times when they can't identify a raptor. It is 100% okay. So this is where I'm going to ask for some engagement here and go to your chat windows and tell me how many species of raptor you see on the screen right now. I'm not going to give you a whole lot of time like I would normally in a live setting where we're together. But go ahead and enter into the chat how many species of raptor that you see on the screen here. Now, I'll get to see your answers a little later, but this is actually a trick question, and this is something that I always share with people. This is 100% the same species. It's a sharp-shinned hawk, 100% across the chart. And the thing that I like to point out is as you look across this chart, this one in the top at the middle here is the classic sharp-shinned hawk pose. This is a flight position you're going to often see of a Sharpie in the field. And oftentimes our eyes will always go right to this square tail that you see. You have to be careful with that because if we look over to the left here, we see a bird that has a pretty round looking tail. This one here is kind of in between round, a little bit of round in the bottom right-hand corner as well. And so if you're, again, using that square tail as a diagnostic field mark, you are going to find that 10% or more of the time you're going to fail. And so it's okay to fail, but what I want to encourage you to do is really look at more of the flight characteristics of this bird to determine that it's truly a sharp-shinned versus a Cooper's hawk. And as you do that and put some of these traits together, the image will start to slowly appear. Now, I mentioned earlier that identifying these raptors is a different form of identification. So if you're like me, you probably have your Peterson or your Sibley field guide that is, invaluable to you when you're out in the birding field. And I'm going to use Peterson as a great example. It's one of my favorite books. That field guide to birds is the one that I recommend to every beginning birder. I think it's the one to start with. And I love the Peterson method where he's using arrows to point to the areas on the bird to look for to diagnostically identify that bird. But where I don't want to say Roger Tory Peterson fell short. He absolutely didn't. This is not a dig towards that method. You can apply his brilliant method to flight identification with just a few minor tweaks. Instead of pointing to the white rump patch on a harrier or the belly band on a red-tailed hawk or the red tail on an adult red-tailed hawk, instead you might point at the shape of the bird, that it's very muscular in nature in terms of a red-tailed hawk, very broad, muscular, heavy-looking wings, how it's holding its wing, whether it's soaring or gliding. It's the same exact method, it's just looking at different types of field marks instead of color. And so we want to throw those color plumage field marks almost out the window. Not quite, because today's optics allow us to see plumage a lot better, even at distance now, so we can use that as a trait in addition to the flight characteristics. But I want to encourage you to really focus on the flight characteristics more than anything else. And so I love this little series of this peregrine because very, very rarely do we see a full color, brilliant, full field mark in view type view of raptors in the sky. Oftentimes the sun is above them. All we see is pure black shadows. So if you look to the far right of the slide, you'll see what we normally see in the middle of the afternoon when peregrines are coming through, and it's the classic peregrine shape as it's gliding and flapping by. So point being, don't rely on those field marks. First look for flight characteristics, demeanor, and how it's flying. Now, one of the things I always tell people is you don't need every piece of the puzzle to determine what the identification of the bird is, but you need at least a few pieces of the puzzle. And as we start to see these pieces come in view, we can start to slowly put them together. And even before that brilliant red tail pops in, many of you probably could tell that this was a red-tailed hawk just by the shape and some of the patagials and other things that we're seeing here. And so point being, you can't diagnostically identify this bird with one piece of the puzzle. It takes at least a few pieces, maybe not all, to have that image really come into clear view, and then you can diagnostically identify the bird. And worst case scenario, if it's a juvenile red-shouldered hawk and maybe you're questioning whether that's a juvenile broadwing or a juvenile red-tail and you couldn't get full view on it, worst case scenario, you mark it down as an unidentified buteo, and that's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with that. So now let's talk about the general families that we're going to talk through with these raptors. So I say general, I use that term very loosely because you're not going to see every family of raptor here. You're going to see the general families that we're going to see across all of North America in one shape or another. So we'll start off with our accipiters. The example here is a classic sharp-shinned hawk in active flight. And the accipiters are really your forest-dwelling hawks that are a little bit more compact, but they have these really long tails that allow them to have really brilliant maneuverability. If you ever see a raptor at your bird feeder in a neighborhood, it's likely a Cooper's hawk or a sharp-shinned hawk. That's where I would start when you want to try and truly identify that bird. Next are our falcons. And falcons, the real quick thing to keep in mind with falcons is it's all about speed. And so these birds tend to have more slender, longer wings that often are swept back, and they are all about speed. Next, we have our bootios, and here we have another image of a red-tailed hawk. And I show the red-tailed hawk over and over because the red-tailed hawk is really the bootio that we're going to use as our foundational bird to compare every other bootio to. And the reason for that is pretty obvious. We see them everywhere. These birds have adapted to life around highway systems, cities. I mean, they are very opportunistic in what they eat, how they hunt, and where they breed. And so they have thrived in North America and continue to do so. And because we see so many of these birds, they start to get ingrained in our head to where we can hardly see anything on this bird and we're already saying red-tailed hawk because it just becomes intuitive. So the bootios are more or less our open land soaring birds. Oftentimes they like forest edges, but they do like to have some open space for the type of hunting that they do. Lastly, in terms of general migrating raptors, will be the eagles. Now, so for today, we are going to go through bald eagle as well as golden eagle. But then in addition to the eagles, we do have vultures that we'll talk through, osprey, northern harrier, which we'll get to in part 2. And then, of course, in some areas of the country, in fact, Bob and I were talking before we got started, you know, the kites are already moving through Texas. So in some areas of the country, you will have kites as well. That's probably not one we'll feature in this series, this 2-part series, but certainly something we can do in the future. So the eagles are our largest migrating raptor that's going to come through. I say largest, and you know, when we consider size, size really comes into play when we have something else relative to the bird to compare things to. So if you have a single eagle in the sky, you could be, you know, if it's 2 or 3 miles out and you don't have a way to judge the distance of that bird, you might not know that it's an eagle until it gets a little closer. So that's where some of the other pieces of the puzzle come into play. And we put those pieces together, and pretty soon an eagle that's 2 or 3 miles out becomes a pretty easy thing to do with a little bit of practice. Okay. So to set the slides up, all of the identification slides are going to be set up the same way. You're going to have on the left side a real quick view of their range across North America. Moving over to the right, you'll see a single image of the bird. I'm also sharing their soaring and gliding profiles, which are very important in terms of those pieces of the puzzle. And then I give you a few quick tips on how to identify these birds in flight. So the Sharpie, as we call them, sharp-shinned hawks, oftentimes we'll go to a hawk watch and hear people calling out Sharpies. Oftentimes these birds are very, very quick in nature, quite buoyant, and they tend to appear more unsteady, with their small size. Their wing beat is pretty incredible. It's incredibly fast, and it comes more from the wrists instead of the whole wing. So Sharpies tend to be more fluttery in their flight, very snappy wing beat that's incredibly fast. And like the other accipiters, especially the coop, they tend to take on a flat, flat, flat glide type technique. Notice that square tail here. Of course, I'm calling out to be careful. That square tail is certainly not diagnostic. While they don't have graduated tail feathers, sometimes things happen that make their tail feathers rough or ragged, or they might be in the middle of a molt that makes their tail appear more round. So be careful of that. Use it as a piece of the puzzle, but not just one to make that identification. The other thing that I like to look at is their head. They tend to tuck their head pretty far back towards their wings, and oftentimes they'll thrust their shoulders, their wrists forward, and it kind of creates this little window, this little pocket for the head to sit nicely within. And that's what we'll look for oftentimes in sharp-shinned hawks. They soar with pretty flat wings, and in a glide, they tend to droop those wings just ever so slightly. So let's see some video of a Sharpie in flight here. So here we have a soaring bird. Notice also how the tail, when it's fanned, it almost looks like it comes to a tiny point as it comes around before it hits the body. You can see just ever so slightly some muscular areas in the secondaries here in the trailing edge of the wing, but notice that the head appears very, very small. These birds tend to soar in really tight circles, and notice that wing flap, how it's fluttery, very, very rapid, it's snappy, and it's more from the wrist outward as opposed to using the entire wing. Look how rapid that wing beat is. Notice also how tight a circle this bird is soaring in. Now we have a flapping and an active flight style of the bird. Notice the wings are slightly drooped when it goes into a glide. Very, very subtle, but it's there. Now we see that more rectangular long tail, especially in active flight. And notice the little pocket that I was talking about where the head fits right inside with those wings. That view right there at the end, I always say they look like little button mushrooms from the grocery store flying overhead. And so that's something to look for. Okay, next in the line of accipiters, we're going to talk to our Cooper's hawk. So very, very similar, very, very difficult to identify these birds, especially as a newbie. And I'm just, again, really, encouraging you to set realistic expectations. The one really, probably one of the larger pieces of advice that I would give you is don't go to a hawk watch thinking you're going to become an expert at identifying 10 raptors the day that you're there. I would say that that's very unrealistic, and it's not going to happen. We've all been there. I've done it, and you will fail. Learn from that failure, and what I would suggest is instead of trying to learn them all at once, target 1 or 2 birds to truly focus on that day that you're there. So if I find myself at the Detroit River Hawk Watch in early to mid-September, I might really focus on a sharp-shinned hawk, a Cooper's hawk, or maybe American kestrel. They come in bigger groups there in September. And I'm going to focus all my effort on those birds and really concentrate on those. And the beauty of that is I come out of that much better at one species than very poor at maybe 8 species. And it's just a much better way to do things, I think. So we compare the soaring profile and gliding profiles of Sharpies and Coops. When you look at this Coop, they tend to have a slightly upturned dihedral. And I didn't say this before, but for those that don't know what a dihedral is, look at this soaring profile here. I say slightly upturned because the wings are just slightly above flat. So where that sharp-shinned hawk had a flat soaring profile, the Cooper's hawk is just slightly upturned. These guys also have a pretty stiff wing beat, but it feels stronger, slightly slower than a Sharpie, and it's more steady. So the bird in general is heavier, it's more steady. You can tell right away, and we're going to see this a little later, that these birds don't get as buffeted by the winds as Sharpies do, and they tend to just ride it out quite well. Notice the rounded tail. In most aspects of flight with the Cooper's hawk, you're going to see that, because they have these graduated tail feathers, it appears that they have this round tail. Much like the sharp-shinned, you can't use that as the one diagnostic field mark because, upwards of 10% of the time you're going to find rough Cooper's hawks that have either a molt or something that's happened to their tail that gives the appearance of a very square tail. One of my favorite places to go work on Coopers and sharp-shinned hawks is early October at Cape May. If you go to the Hawk Watch at Cape May, they get a much more even pairing or amount of Coopers and sharp-shinned hawks flying through, which gives you a much bigger challenge than, say, where I am in Michigan. Most of our migrant accipiters that are coming through our Hawk Watches are sharp-shinned hawks by far. So just by that alone, your brain is telling you it's got to be a sharp-shinned because the numbers tell me I'm going to be right more often than not. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. That to me is a piece of the puzzle. If there are more Sharpies at a site than a Coop, that is a piece of the puzzle. But when you go to a place like Cape May where those numbers are more evened out, it creates a much more challenging learning experience. And if you're afforded the opportunity to do that, I absolutely encourage you to do that. These birds tend to appear to have thinner looking wings. I don't necessarily think they're thinner by structure per se, but because if we look at this bird, look how far the head is projecting forward, and notice that the leading edge of the wing is very much at a right angle compared to the body. Sharpies, where they throw those wrists or shoulders forward, it kind of creates that pocket for the head. More often than not, Coopers will show that front end or that leading edge of the wing as being very flat, straight, right angles to the body. Be careful though, as with everything, it's not always 100%. I've noticed in higher winds, when they're in active flight, they tend to sometimes throw those shoulders or those wrists forward, and they can appear to have that smaller head, even though they don't, just because they're not projecting. So I'm talking about this head projection right here, where the head's going quite a ways out, it's projecting in front of the body here. Okay, let's see some video of our Cooper's hawk. Many hawk watch sites you go to, they'll refer to them as Coops. All right, so that stiffer wing beat, again, just very ever so slight dihedral, that upturned wing in a soar, you can see right there, just barely above flat, so very, very subtle. Notice as he comes around, the head's projecting quite a ways forward. It's a lot more substantial than what we saw in that Sharpie. Again, the structure of the wing's roughly the same, but because he's holding them out further, he's not thrusting those wrists or shoulders forward, they appear longer in general. This bird actually, if you look close, he must have just eaten his nape here, just below his throat, kind of one of the first parts of their digestive process. He's got some food in there. So the lazy circles, a lot more larger circles that they soar in compared to the Sharpie. Notice that this bird, even in these winds, is handling it quite well. It's more steady overall. Wings are drooped ever so slightly in active flight, especially once they go into a glide, you can see that. And even in those high winds, hopefully you notice just how much more steady and straight lined that bird was in active flight. So let's concentrate a little bit on comparing these two birds side by side, because by far it's the two toughest birds to distinguish at any hawk watch, and no matter what time of season you go, I guarantee you there will be some conversation that will happen over Coops and Sharpies. So on the left we have our Coop, on the right we have our Sharpie. At least it's left and right for me. Hopefully that's the same for you. I'm going to put my cursor on the Coop here. This is the Cooper's hawk. Notice the head projection. Here the head is projecting or thrust forward way in front of the body, often looking a lot bigger in flight. Notice this again, just to repeat, that flat leading edge of the wing here, very perpendicular to the body. Now we go over to the Sharpie. On my right here, we can see this little pocket that I was talking about earlier. Because this bird is thrusting its wings forward, creates this little area, this little window pocket here for the head to fit nicely within. And that alone helps to give this appearance of a much smaller head. So there's less head projection, and that head looks really small, especially at a distance. Now let's feature a video of them side by side.
The Sharpshin versus Cooper's comparison represents one of the most difficult pairings, but there are clues that help distinguish the two. Notice the Cooper's hawk on the right has a longer, bulkier tail that also feels more round. Don't forget, however, the round versus square tail doesn't always hold true. Also notice the Sharpie on the left shows a smaller head that is tucked back closer to the body, where the Coop's head projects forward. While soaring, Sharpies will flap more often because they are less stable, where the Coop holds steady. Also look as the Sharpshin hawk is making tighter circles. The bird is actually starting to get ahead of the Coop. Comparing the wing flap is easier when side by side. Notice the Cooper's hawk has a slightly slower wing beat, but more importantly, it's using more of the entire wing, whereas the Sharpie is quicker, snappier, and flaps more from the wrist outward. Check out this Sharpie displaying its tendency to flap more often, where the Coop is gliding longer between flaps.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed that clip. So just to give give a little sales pitch there. That is an actual clip from Hawks on the Wing, the movie that I filmed and produced. That is available on the HMANA website as well as hawksonthewing.com. And that what you just saw there is the premise of that entire project is showing these incredibly tough birds side by side on the same window while we walk you through how to identify them. So I hope you really enjoyed that. We're going to see some more side by sides throughout today, as well as when we come back together in March. And the video offers several side by sides of all the eastern species available. So, all right, so getting back to our talk here, comparing Sharpies and Coops, this is the one area of the talk where we're going to get a little bit away from our flight ID, just because the questions come in so regularly about Sharpies and Coops. I thought it'd be worth featuring a few photos and pointing out some traits to look for when the birds are perched. So again, I don't know if Zoom has flip-flopped the screen, but on my left here with the tree background is the Cooper's hawk. On my right here is the sharp-shinned hawk perched out in the open. So we look at the first thing that I want to show you is when we look at this head, especially the side profile, he turned his head just perfect for me. You can see that it's more of a squared off looking head. Also notice that the nape, or the back of the head here, is very light. It almost looks like the coop has a cap. And so that's a little trick there. Coop cap, it's not a helmet. When we look at the sharp-shinned over here on my right with the clear sky background, you'll see that it's a more rounded head. And it's also, even as a juvenile, you'll see the nape is dark compared to the lighter nape over here on the Cooper's hawk. So if you think you see a helmet on the bird as opposed to the cap that we see on this Cooper's hawk, the helmet represents a good piece of the puzzle to dial things into a sharp-shinned hawk. But there are a couple other things in these photos that you can look for. One of which, remember I talked about graduated tail feathers? This is a good view of those graduated tail feathers compared to the Sharpie here in the open on the right, on my right here, where they're all pretty well even, and that's what gives that appearance of a squared off looking tail. The other thing that I want to show you too, again, I have the Coopers on my left with the snow in the background, the Sharpies on the right with the blue sky. Notice the legs of the sharp-shinned here versus the Coop. If you have a very long-toed, alien-looking foot and leg, very thin, just very alien-like, it is likely a sharp-shinned hawk. If you have a leg, especially this leg that we see here, that appears relative to the body size to look like a number 2 pencil, you likely have a Cooper's hawk. Now, I personally, like I'm recommending, would never use that alone or any one of these alone to identify these birds. I'm going to put all those species together and try to come to that ID. And you know what? Sometimes you don't get there, and that's okay. But oftentimes, with a few of these techniques, you'll get there pretty easily. Now we'll move on into some falcons, and we're going to talk today just about our American kestrel. And this is a bird that's very, very near and dear to myself and my family. We have open land prairie here in Southwest Michigan, and we host an American kestrel box. And for the last 3 years, we've been successful. They've been successful at their brood. And so it's been absolutely just a joy to share that with our kids. But in terms of flight ID, the kestrel is very, very buoyant, very thin-winged. And to me, this is a tip that I love to share with people. Their wings look like flapping bananas in the wind. They're very slender. They come to those points, and the way they flap those wings, those thin, slender wings, it looks like little banana peels for wings. And that's a great tip that I picked up from Eric Brunchy, who's the counter over at Cape May. So just a little shout out for one of the great experts in the field, and something that he came up with that's really clever. Look at the soaring profile and glide profile for this bird, very flat winged in a soar and slightly drooped in a profile. Again, they're very banana-like looking wings. They're very slender and pointed. The wing beat itself is very fluttery, and in some cases can be very shallow as it's fluttery, and it just looks like they're putting very little effort into just staying in the air. Speaking of staying in the air, this bird does tend to lose altitude quite quickly. So if you see what you know to be a falcon because of the shape of the wings, and you see it losing altitude and having to flap to regain that altitude quite often, that's a good piece of the puzzle for determining a kestrel. Overall, I've always called them very dainty, just because they're so small. But don't let that shy you away from the sheer power and aggression that this bird can show, especially on territory. They are incredible and very quick and powerful in how they hunt. So let's see a video of our kestrel, and I've said it a few times, but look for those banana-like looking wings. All right, now here's a kestrel, and obviously being buffeted in a soar. Look at those banana-like thin wings there. All right, there's that flat soaring profile rather. And this bird, I can tell you, was in some pretty heavy winds. So now it's into the wind, it's facing to the wind. Look at it get buffeted right back around. It's having to flex and use that tail to stay on course. But he's still staying up. Now look at this bird losing altitude. He'll flap and kind of come back up. But as he's more in active flight and in that glide, you're going to notice that the wings almost look more drooped. And this is the profile that's toughest for me. In learning this bird, I had that was tough for me in determining kestrel versus Sharpie. Oftentimes, like right there, they can look very Sharpie-like, and then you get that wing flap, and that tells a different story. So remember, put those pieces together, and the image will come clear. Okay, let's get into some Bootios. So again, remember, I'm not featuring all the falcons. I didn't feature all of the accipiters. This is just part one, representing more of the regularly occurring raptors that we're going to see across the majority of North America. And this, if there's a bird that we're going to see at almost every site, this is it. Our famed red-tailed hawk, I think their sheer numbers tend to make people underrate them. One of my ever favorite raptors. I just always loved red-tailed, and I love this muscular look to the wing. So let's talk about muscular. So every now and then people will ask, well, what do you mean by muscular? And I think one of the ways I learned it years and years ago, Bob Pettit said it best. If you take your arm and come out here like this, like a bodybuilder, but then flex that and turn it upside down, that's the muscular nature that I'm talking about. Now, I don't have any of that, but this red tail has plenty of muscle, and this trailing edge and the secondaries and primary flight feathers is what we're talking about right here. Very, very muscular. The other thing that comes into play, because these wings are just so heavy and so muscular, in flight, we'll see this in the video, the tail it just looks like an extension of the body, and you don't know where the tail ends because it's like the wings go into the tail instead of the body with all that muscular nature. Notice the soaring profile. Again, we have another slight upturned dihedral, especially in a soar, and you'll notice that. I like to compare the amount of upturned dihedral in a red tail is roughly about the same as a golden eagle, which is vastly different than the other Bootios and then the bald eagle. So it's a way to kind of dial things in for those birds. These birds are very heavy and very stable in flight when comparing a red tail to a red-shouldered hawk that's soaring in any kind of winds. If the red tail gets buffeted off course, it might do one wing flap or shrug its shoulders just to get back on course, where a red shoulder will get thrown around like a rag doll. He'll have to flap 3 or 4, maybe half a dozen times to get back on course. And just the difference between that right there is often enough to know that it's a red-shouldered versus a red tail. So let's see what this bird looks like. Before we see the video, just look for the wing flap. It's actually pretty shallow, but what's always kind of struck me in a red-tailed hawk is that the wing beat to me is very fast relative to the size of this bird overall. It's certainly not a super fast wing beat, but I think relative to how large it is, I think it's quite fast. All right, so let's see our red in flight. Now we have a soaring bird. And notice very large head projecting in front there. Notice the trailing edge of the wings when he comes around, very muscular and round in that trailing edge, the back edge. As he continues to come around, there's those muscles that we can see. Look at these bulging secondaries right here. And it almost looks like the wing just ends into the tail instead of the body. There's so much muscle going on. There's that slight upturn in the dihedral, just 1-2 flaps to get back on course. Very little flapping when they're soaring. They're incredibly suited for soaring, which makes them just a classic Bootio. There we can see a little bit of white in the tail. Nowhere near as much as we'll see in a harrier, but at certain angles, it can really catch you off guard and confuse. So you got to be careful with that one. All right, we should see this bird in active flight here. Yeah, here we go. So here's our wing flap. Notice it's pretty shallow. And in active flight, those shoulders or wrists there are thrust forward just ever so slightly. Notice the very large, lanky body that kind of trails right into the tail. It's hard to tell where the tail begins and the body ends on these birds. Next in our bootios that we're going to talk about today is our ever-famed broad-winged hawk. This is the bird that often brings people to hawk watches in search of seeing that 1,000 or 10,000 or in some cases 50 or 100,000 birds in a day. And it's certainly a life-changing event, at least it was for me. You know, seeing 80, 85, 90,000 broadwings come in one day at Detroit is certainly a very distinct connection with nature. It was very, very exciting. And I hope that you can all experience that in your lifetime as well. But in terms of what we're seeing in these guys flying, this is an adult broadwing in active flight. Notice here, we're going to go off script a little bit and see this trailing edge here, this kind of border on the trailing edge of the wings that you see in both juvenile and adult broadwings. I like to tell people these birds, even in molt, they just in flight, they tend to always look really clean and proper. Everything's in order and everything's looking good. Their wings are held at pretty well right angles to the body, and their wing shape looks like kind of stocky paring knives for you cooks out there. The wing beat's pretty snappy, but it's quite stiff. And oftentimes, especially if it's a good broadwing day, you're not going to see these guys flapping much unless they're at the bottom of their stream out. They are masterful at soaring, and oftentimes in a soar, you'll never see them flap. So let's check out some video of our broadwing. All right, look at that paring knife, classic paring knife shaped wing on the broadwing. This is an adult broadwing, just soaring. Even at a distance, oftentimes with these adults, you can see that broad tail band. It's pretty diagnostic when it comes to plumage in that respect. Notice that paring knife flat on the front, comes out flat, but then cuts in at the outer primaries there to more of a point. And that pointed edge of the wing is important when comparing broadies to red shoulders. So keep that in mind. I know it's a ways away, but we'll do more of that comparing in March between these bootios. Pretty flat winged in a soar. Again, that's that paring knife shape, fan tail, and I don't believe we saw that bird flap once in that soar, just further proving the point that these birds are so well suited for soaring. This bird's at the end of a stream, so he's more in active flight, flapping a little bit. It's pretty snappy. A little bit more accipiter-like, not as accipiter-like as, say, a red-shouldered would be, very snappy, and they tend to hold their wings, hopefully we'll see it here, just slightly drooped. Here at the bottom, we can see the heavier, lankier red-tailed coming into view. Just for comparison, you can see just how small these little guys are. It's just a wonderful example of a classic raptor at a hawk watch. Okay, so the last couple birds we're going to feature our eagles for today, and then we're going to open things up for some questions and some engagement. So here's our bald eagle. Bald eagles, to me, are basically 2x8 planks of wood with a head and a tail. If you paint a 2x8 or a 2x10 black or dark brown, that's basically the wing structure of especially a soaring bald eagle. And very, very plank-like. You'll hear some of these birds in books, and others will describe them as very plank-like, and the bald eagle's classic plank-like wings. Their soaring profile is just dead flat in almost all cases soaring, but they do tend to droop those wings in a glide. Their wing beat is incredibly slow and powerful, but the coolest thing to look for is their upstroke goes far higher than their downstroke compared to where their body is. So if their body's here, their wing goes way further up than it does down when it comes down below. We're not going to get into the differences between juvenile, immature, and adult bald eagles because we want to focus on flight tips today. And so ignore the white head and tail. Obviously, if you see that, that's a 100% diagnostic. You will know you have a bald eagle. And oftentimes the bald eagles tend to be more prevalent at the lakeshore or seaboard count sites. So let's check out what our bald eagle looks like in flight. Remember that plank-like wing structure we're going to see real quick here. Look at that, just flat wing, very parallel to each other. The leading edge of the wing is very much at right angle to the body. Notice how large and prominent that head looks. Now, part of that head is because of their massive bill for how they're built to, tear apart fish and such. But their head is huge, especially in comparison to the length of that tail. So again, that to me is a 2x8 plank of wood with a head and tail. Very, very plank-like. Notice that large head, flat, absolutely flat wings. Look at that deep stroke on that upstroke, very, very much higher than the body when compared to when it goes below the body. That head is projecting way out in front. Notice in slow-mo, this bird is going to stop on a downstroke. Most of the flat-winged raptors like this will flap, and when they stop flapping, they stop on a downstroke. So keep that in mind. Look at that, just ever so slight droop to the wings in active flight and glide. It's pretty flat, but as the wings start to go out towards the tips, they do tend to droop ever so slightly. So the eagle that's less plank-like and actually more booty-o looking would be our golden eagle that we see here. Again, we're not going to concentrate on juvenile, immature, or subadult, adult golden eagles. We're going to concentrate more on shape, flight demeanor. They have very slow, powerful, but very flexible wing beats. Compared to a bald eagle, these guys, the tips of their wings are almost like loose flags at the end. I like to compare these guys. You go by a used car lot and they have those air-powered things that are flailing all over the place. Those are very flexible wings in a golden eagle that look very flexible like that. And so look for that compared to the more stiff wing beat in the bald eagle. Their heads appear much smaller, so in terms of shape, you're not going to have that head projection. Their tails, because of that, then appear much longer relative to the size of their head. Again, I mentioned earlier in the red-tailed hawk slide that they have a slight dihedral, that upturn wing. Especially soaring, that's very similar in nature to the red-tailed hawk, but then in a glide, they're flat to maybe just a slight modified dihedral. And when I say modified, the wing goes up and over. So let's see what this bird looks like. Okay, so a little bit more muscular. Remember the muscular nature of the trailing edge of that wing, the back. Look at the more flexible wing we see in that wing flap. As it comes around, look for that muscular nature. There's the dihedral, that slight upturn in the wing. As we start the video again and he comes around, look for that muscular trailing edge in the back of the wing structure. It looks more like a booty-o than an eagle, especially compared to a bald eagle. And regardless of distance, you're going to see that curve, that rear, that trailing edge there, that muscular look. Whether it's close or far away. So it's a really good one to key in on. Look at the wingtips. They just look much more flexible as it flaps. Look at it just looks like a flag almost flapping in the wind. Look at the tail, how much longer it appears. Now, this bird in slow-mo is going to stop on an upstroke and slowly settle back down. So birds that tend to have dihedrals will stop on upstrokes. So he's flapping, he stops, and then slowly settles back down. Harriers do the same thing. No surprise given their dihedral. So let's compare these guys real quick and look at a comparison side by side. Remember I was talking about head projection. If we compare the length of the head to the length of the tail on a golden eagle, it's usually half the length or more, or less rather. And then when we look conversely at the bald eagle, look how much larger the head is with that beak. And in this particular view, it almost looks about the same size as the tail. So in a bald eagle, the head appears half or longer than half of the length of the tail. So let's see a little side-by-side from hawks on the wing.
Bald and golden eagles are both large and prominent in the sky, but some key differences are easy to pick out once you know what to look for. Even though the bald eagle on the left is closer, it shows thick, rectangular planked wings. It looks like a 2x8 plank of wood with a head and a tail. Speaking of heads, make sure to key in on the size of the head compared to the length of the tail. The bald eagle's head can appear as long as its tail, where the golden's head appears to be half the length of its tail or smaller. The golden on the right appears more booty-o-like with more muscular wings. Notice too, the bald eagle is soaring with flat wings. In comparison, the golden eagle has a slight upturned dihedral. The wing beat of the bald eagle is slow and stiff, but look at that deep upstroke. Golden eagles have slow wing beats as well, but they're uniformly shallow. Check out how the bald eagle ends on a downstroke when flapping. In comparison, the golden eagle ends on an upstroke before settling into its glide.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed that. So last that we'll go through here is our turkey vulture. So remember how we said red tails, we see so many of them, they become that bird to compare other bootios to. Well, vultures can be that for all other raptors. It's probably one of the easiest birds to identify because of how often we see them. And I don't want to take away, some beginners may not see it that way, and I respect that. But it doesn't take too long to very easily solidify the turkey vulture in your mind. And the two big things are that massively steep dihedral that we'll see in a soar, as well as those silver looking trailing edge to the primaries and secondaries. Their tail tends to appear very long and rectangular in most areas of flight. Their lack of head feathers makes their heads appear almost completely gone. In some aspects of flight, they appear headless. And their wing beat, if you're lucky enough to see them flap their wings, because it doesn't happen very often, is quite deep and very steady. Again, look at that range map. I mean, they're just everywhere. You can see them all over the place. And even more so, we're starting to see more overwintering raptors, even in southern Michigan now, which has been kind of fun to see. So let's see what these guys look like in flight. You'll see right off the bat, he's going to shrug his shoulders. That's a very common thing to see in gliding or soaring turkey vultures. Look how he's teetering and being buffeted around in the wings, but he wants nothing to do with flapping his wings. He'll sometimes go totally sideways and just flex or bring himself back to that glide or soar to make sure that he can just continue on without flapping. Now we get to see that classic soaring posture with a really steep dihedral. As he comes around, look for pretty much a lack of head. Right there, you can't even see a head. Barely see any head. Right there, he kind of comes into view. But look at that tail, how it's very stocky and rectangular, hanging kind of trailing behind. And now we get to see this modified dihedral. Look at the wing come up and then flatten out to the tips, which look like fingers at the tips of their wings. That's a classic modified dihedral that you'll see in turkey vultures gliding. One of the best places. I love Detroit River for vultures in mid-October because oftentimes if the winds are just right, they will glide just like that and flap right over you. Okay, so this is the point where I'm going to ask for some engagement. You heard me talk about the side-by-sides offered on Hawks on the Wing. This is I'm only showing you the side-by-sides that deal with the species that we talked about today. So this is just a very small amount of what we have to offer. But go to your comments and your chat, and if there's one in here that you'd like to see, type it in the chat, and our Julie Brown will speak to me. She'll unmute and let me know which ones people are calling out. So remember, we've seen bald eagle versus golden eagle, Sharpie versus Coop. We can certainly play those again if you'd like to see them. But if there's another one, let me know what you'd like to see.
Okay, well, we have lots of suggestions.
You have to pick, Julie.
Yeah, you pick it. We have Sharpie Kestrel, Broadwing versus Redtail, Bald versus Turkey, Broadwing versus Redtail. Got a few for Broadwing versus Redtail, so maybe you want to start with that one.
Sure, let's start there.
Okay.
There is a noticeable size difference between these two birds. Nevertheless, correctly identifying them can still be tricky. Check out how muscular and bulging the red-tailed hawk is on the left. The bird is a stocky, solid bootial that is at home in the sky. In comparison, notice the trailing edge of the wings on the broadwing hawk extends straight out from the body before tapering to a swept-back point. Broadwings also look clean and proper, where red-taileds only look fresh occasionally. The red-tailed has a slight upturned dihedral, where the broadwing shows a flat-winged appearance. Both hawks are stable in flight, however the broadwing will buck in winds where the red-tailed handles it. The wing beat of the red-tailed hawk on the left is shallow but rhythmic. In comparison, the broadwing on the right is snappier and sometimes feels more like an accipiter. Also notice the red-tailed hawk flaps more where the broadwing avoids flapping and glides longer.
Okay. So Julie, if it's okay, I went over real quick to Facebook where we're streaming this live, and there were a couple people asking for bald eagle versus turkey vulture. I think it was bald eagle. Let me just make sure.
Okay.
Yeah, let's do golden versus turkey vulture. He just said eagle because that dihedral is a little closer, so we'll try that one.
When comparing golden eagles to turkey vultures, there are a few things to look for that will shed some light. When soaring, their profiles are slightly different.
Whoops.
The golden on the left looks more booty-o-like with curved wings, where the vulture on the right is rectangular or plank-like. Notice how active the golden eagle is as it flaps more often. The vulture rarely flaps at all and is far less stable in flight. Both birds hold their wings in a dihedral, but the turkey vulture's dihedral is more pronounced. Again, notice the golden eagle is far more active as it flaps more often. The turkey vulture does everything it can to avoid flapping and is tippy or wobbly in flight. It also holds its wings in a modified dihedral when gliding, where the golden retains the same gently sweeping dihedral.
Okay, Julie, should we do Sharpie versus Kestrel?
That's what I was going to recommend. Yep.
Okay, we'll do it.
Comparing Sharpies to Kestrels is all about looking at the shape of the wings. Kestrels are classic falcons with long, thin wings. This becomes obvious when compared to the stubbier, rounded wings of Sharpies. Also check out the rectangular tail on the Kestrel. When soaring, Kestrels hold their wings straight out from their bodies and they come to points, where the Sharpies' wings are pushed slightly forward and are more rounded. Kestrels use more of the wing when flapping, and it looks fluttery, as if they're slapping the air. Sharpies have quick, snappy wing beats from the wrist outward. Watch as the Kestrel on the right moves up and down while gliding, a classic behavior. The Sharpie also has a tendency to right itself by flapping more often. These two birds in active flight seem similar at first, but look close at the Kestrel's swept-back, pointed wings along with long, slender tail compared to the rounder, overall stockier look of the Sharpie.
Okay, so Julie, I think at this point I'd like to maybe open it up for some questions. Just keep in mind I can't see, so kind of look to you and Jane to help moderate that.
Why did it not show perfect? So common.
Did you say peregrine? I think you said peregrine. I don't know if you can unmute and verify. We will show that in part 2 in March for sure. It was very tough with birds like osprey, northern harrier, and birds like that at some sites are quite common. And so if that is one of the birds you were asking about, those represent where it kind of got tough to split it up. Knowing we only had about an hour, we had to make the cut somewhere, and so unfortunately some of them didn't make the list. I assure you though, in March we will feature the rest of especially the eastern birds, and then we'll have all the side-by-sides available for you to choose from at the end of the presentation. What other questions?
You can feel free to type your question into the comment box if it's easier, and I can read it to Josh. We have a question, are there any significant differences in gender within species?
Oh, very good question. So there are some species that do show that sexual dimorphism. The American kestrel is probably one of the better examples. The male looks vastly different from the female, showing a lot more blue and orange. So definitely go to your field guide to check that out. There are some subtle differences between male and female rough-legged hawks. We didn't talk about rough-leggeds today. But in terms of things like red-tailed hawks, red-shouldered hawks, Coops, Sharpies, you're not going to see that sexual dimorphism. And in birds like red-tails, you can tell a difference if they're side by side. Usually the female is much larger, but when they're by themselves, you really don't have any relative comparison, so you can't tell. Another one that's sexually dimorphic is the northern harrier, which again we'll talk about in March. And at a hawk watch, you might find people or hear people calling out the gray ghost, which is the adult male northern harrier, which is a real specialty bird to see. So there is some of that. I encourage you to go to your books and kind of check that out. Any field guide will show that. In terms of raptor field guides, anything by Jerry Ligori is phenomenal. He's like the king of Raptor ID. And my first edition of Hawks in Flight by Pete Dunn and a couple others, Clay Sutton, that's an invaluable book. I love that book because it really forces you to focus on flight ID.
Good to know.
Okay. Do their flight characteristics change because of age?
This is not something that I could answer. My gut says no, but if there's something, Julie, you'd like to add about that, if you've had experience as a hawk watcher, that's not something that I've ever been able to notice or see.
Not so much. Maybe kind of some younger birds might have longer tails. Certainly can take different flight paths, and you're more prone to see younger raptors at some hawk watches versus other ones, coastal versus inland, but I don't know a great deal about their characteristics looking different between young and old.
Sure. You bring up a good point about flight feathers, though, or tail feathers being longer. Bald eagles, too, especially first year bald eagles, the juveniles will have longer flight feathers, so they appear larger. And then you mentioned immatures versus adults. There's also, in some species, a timing difference, too. So we'll see adult golden eagles come through earlier than their immature counterparts. They tend to come later.
Someone else is wondering, when does the hawk watch start at Lake Erie?
First day of September at Detroit. Yep. Now, we're in, obviously a very different year right now. So I would say go onto Google, find the Detroit River Hawk Watch. You can contact Jerry Jordan or any one of their volunteers or site coordinator there, and make sure that one, Lake Erie Metro Park is open, so that folks can drive in, and two, please really, ask about the rules and how they're keeping their counter and their volunteers safe, to make sure that you can safely adhere to that and go out and enjoy the birds. So first day of September has always been the first day at Detroit River or Lake Erie Metro Park.
Okay, one other question, any differences in nesting site preferences, which is kind of getting away from migration, but you can comment on that if you want.
Sure. Nesting site preferences, I guess, in terms of what? Like per species? Did they say anything about that? Like what species like each, different type of nesting site?
Yeah, maybe per species, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm certainly not someone who's focused on breeding raptors, but I know, like I mentioned earlier, about red tails being so opportunistic. I mean, they'll nest on building ledges more often than not, actually, in trees and large stick nests. either old, great horn nests or past red-tailed nests they'll take over. Sometimes they'll build it, in a crook of a tree as well. Other than that, it's just not an area that I've focused on. So I'm not gonna, try and answer something that I don't know. How about one last question, Julie? And I think we better wrap up given we're a little past 1.
Okay. Okay, one last question. Will the hawks migrating to Michigan stay in Michigan?
Some will overwinter in Michigan. We've had golden eagles overwinter, even though often they'll go much further north. I think we have some red tails that will stop and stay. That's anecdotal. I don't have proof of that. And I found, especially when you look at eBird data as well, that we have far more sharp-shinned hawks in southern Michigan in winter than we do in the summer. The books show Sharpies as nesting in southern Michigan very commonly, and there's not a lot of data showing that. I think they're nesting more further north, and I tend to see almost all coops in the summer here in southern Michigan, and it's not until fall and into winter that I start to see a lot more Sharpie action. So good question. With that, I do want to point out on the screen here, I thank you so much for your time and your questions. Feel free to reach out to us either on Facebook via email or on our website through our contact. We will feature Julie Brown next month, celebrating International Hawk Migration Week. So we're really gearing up for that. We can't wait. If you liked some of the content that you saw today, Hawks on the Wing is available on the HMANA website at HMANA.org. Just go to their store and you can see that. And you can also pick it up at hawksonthewing.com, as well as find tons of great information on both websites there. So thank you so much for your support of HMANA and all that we are doing to help support our sites, especially more now than ever. And we look forward to sharing this recording with you on our website and on Facebook. And we will see you in a month. Everybody have a great day.